Europe Out Loud, a podcast about Europe's history, culture, and civilization. Brought to you by the Martens Center, with Federico Reo.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Europe Out Loud, a podcast series that brings European culture and civilization and history to bear on problems of contemporary EU policy and politics. I am delighted to be joined on the platform by Professor Constantine Arvanitopoulos. Welcome, Constantine.
Thank you. Thank you, Federico, for the kind invitation.
Yeah, Constantine is, apart from being a dear friend, most importantly for the purposes of our conversation, is a man of considerable achievements both in academia and in politics. He is the Caramelist Chair of Hellenic and European Studies at the Fletcher School of Tufts University in Boston. But he had a distinguished career in public service, in politics, achieving the rank of Minister of Education in 2014. So he's both a policymaker and a scholar.
2012.
Yes. I thought, Constantine, that your scholarship is particularly interesting to discuss at this juncture, because you are really at the intersection between comparative politics and especially a reflection on democratization and international relations. So I thought that we could bring up an aspect of a topic that I have discussed often on this podcast, which is democracy, the state of democracy in the West, in Europe and in the West, but that you could give us a privileged, perspective on the state of democracy in America and also on the way national democratization processes or democratic baselighting interact with international politics and great power competition. And I would suggest that we get straight into the topic, and maybe starting from America. We are, very slowly approaching the 200th anniversary of an important book on American democracy, probably the most important seminal book on American democracy. That's Tocqueville's classic Democracy in America, which was published in 1835. So we are almost 2 centuries later. And American democracy looked at from Brussels, where I'm sitting, doesn't look great, to be honest with you. Despite the fact that Biden won, but still we are just above a year from the infamous storming of the Capitol at the hand of violent Trump supporters, whipped out by the defeated president himself. So I guess my first question to kick off the conversation is, what's the state of American democracy? How does it look like from Boston? And should we Europeans be worried about it?
Well, let me start by thanking you, Federico, for your invitation and the kind introduction. I would say that, unfortunately, American democracy is in crisis, if not in peril. And I would say that Trump's lingering shadow over the political system and the Republican Party, his populist and liberal tendencies that resulted in the insurrection that you just mentioned of previous January, is just the epiphenomenon. The crisis in American democracy is a result of an assortment of deep and sweeping historical changes. I would start with the inequalities that sound very much like a cliche these days, because we repeat these factors that are undoing our democracies. But I think inequalities in America are sapping the foundation of American society and polity. Let's not forget that the United States, more than any other country, is a melting pot, a country that is so culturally, racially, and ethnically diverse that needed a linchpin. And this linchpin, for many years, has been the linchpin of this diverse polity, has been the dream and the expectation of material prosperity, the so-called American dream. And I think that for a number of years, decades or so, the American political system experienced centripetal forces because most of its citizens felt that they had a stake. They were part of this American dream. Now, this is no longer the case. Globalization, brought about growth, trade, development, and profit, but in a very uneven way. And more than that, if you will, in America, it brought an end to a long American tradition. It brought about a decoupling of the corporation from the local community. The corporations in a globalized environment left America. Most of them went to foreign lands for larger profits, cheaper labor, less taxes. And in many respects, that represented the end of the 40s tradition in America. That's one thing. The second thing I think we have experienced at the same time are the technological changes that bring about a new divide in societies, a new stratification between computer and technologically literate citizens and technologically illiterate that are being left behind. Citizens that experience automation leading them to unemployment, citizens that they don't have the means or the stamina to acquire new skills to be competitive in the workplace and get employment again, or citizens that see their profession becoming obsolete because of the digitalization or the centralization of economic activity in various sectors of the economy that renders obsolete many professions. Now, take those changes, globalization, technological changes, and combine them with identity politics. Identity politics, and what you have is social unrest, because these economic developments exacerbate already existing cultural and racial tensions in America. All of a sudden, the fear of uncertainty from these sweeping changes turns to a social anger against minorities and minoritarian politics that threaten, together with the demographic shift that we are experiencing in America, the white population that has historically been the dominant group in American society. So what you have is a white backlash, and this becomes exploited by leaders such as Trump and not only. Add the last factor, and I will end with that is discussed by Fukuyama and others, which has to do with institutional decay. And what these people are talking about is the fact that the United States is a unique combination of a majoritarian electoral system and strong minoritarian institutions. Let me give you an example. I'm sure you know them, but just for our listeners and our audience. The Senate, for example, is highly disproportionate in its representation, with 2 senators per state elected regardless of population. You have Wyoming with 580,000 citizens and California with 40 million citizens, and yet both of those states elect 2 senators only. And that translates to disproportionality. We have disproportionality in that sense in the Electoral College, whose, of course, direct election of the president is exceptional among presidential democracies. And what we see then is a discrepancy between the outcome in the popular vote and the Electoral College, more and more. Why? Because the cynicism, the instrumentalism in politics, and the polarization have identified the so-called swing states, 10, 11 of them, that have the large number of the electorates, and so these become the main battlefields of the election, and so you have the discrepancy. Add to that gerrymandering, add to that that try to alter the composition of precincts, counties, and so on, add to that efforts towards suppression of the vote, that you have in various state legislations that are controlled by Republican majorities, that they feel that demographically they are losing their dominance. And add to that the last factor that is called political polarization. and you have a legitimacy crisis of American democratic institutions. Let me make one footnote regarding political polarization, because I think that is exacerbating all these political problems in the American political system. Of course, political polarization we had in the past in America, because the nature of the American political system is binary by itself. A number of features of the American political system, are susceptible to polarization. The binary choice is deeply embedded in the US electoral system. It has created a very rigid political system with two parties. But over the last decades, over the last 3 decades, I would say, Federico, that the two parties have reinforced their binary character. Why? Because the two main parties, the Democrats and Republicans, were large associations in the past. They tried to encompass different ideologies and different cleavages. Now what we have is the homogenization, the ideological homogenization of the two major parties that reinforce binary opposites, urban versus rural, religious versus secular, racial versus ethnic. So that homogenization makes the American political system even more rigid. And the last comment is that this polarization trickles down to all the levels of society. With media and social media, we have a vicious cycle. Why? Because a polarized system sends into the political institutions extremists. Why is that? Because the more polarized your political discourse, the more chances you have to get elected. So this becomes a vicious circle. And this kind of polarization, we tended to identify with less developed countries, never with developed countries in as far as the intensity of it and the length of time that it has been with us. So for all these structural reasons, I would say that American democracy is in deep crisis, if not in peril. And of course, it matters for us in Europe because America is the leader of the leading power of the West, and it sets the tone in many occasions.
Yeah, thanks, Constantine. That's a very comprehensive overview of all the issues, and your sort of the ending of your answer also is a nice bridge to the other dimension of this problem that I wanted to discuss. As you say, America has been a beacon and has been ultimately the center of the hegemon of a benign, if I may say so, empire of democracy, which is also one of the reasons why we Europeans became democrats, American hegemony, of course, after World War II. So I would like to move now from America as such to the global repercussions and the global trends that this disease or this malaise, at least of American democracy, might have. And well, the obvious question for us Europeans is the one I was hinting at the beginning, right? The stabilization of our democratic systems would have probably been impossible without America's benign hegemony and without the security umbrella that NATO offered after World War II. And now that America is experiencing a democratic malaise, we have seen in the last decade or so also in Europe signs of democratic backsliding.
Right.
And therefore, the question that comes naturally to me, looking at the problem from this side of the Atlantic, from the European side of the Atlantic, is how much of the democratic malaise and democratic backsliding that we are witnessing in the old continent is the result of the undermining of American hegemony and the undermining of the American security umbrella. Put it more brutally, can democracy survive in a post-American Europe if we get there?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I would say, Federico, that what happened in the aftermath of the Cold War was a sense of triumphalism that prevailed in the West, and especially in the United States. And this triumphalism, was reflected in the famous essay by Fukuyama about the end of history. That, you know, that was it. We had prevailed, democracy had prevailed, and with the help of the technology, we could spread democracy throughout the planet. And I think that what happened then, we saw, especially after 9/11, we saw a very aggressive kind of crusade for democracy. And I think that this changed the American policy. It distorted it in many ways, in the sense that America, from a beacon of democracy that you described, became the crusader of democracy. And I think that this thing, together with the war on terror, distorted American foreign policy, and I think that led to a period of malaise, in the sense that it sucked American power and American resources. The war on terror, this is, sucked American power and American resources in the quicksand of the Middle East and Afghanistan. The neoconservative project about, you know, spreading democracy in, especially in countries that did not experience a prior culture of democracy. I think that reflected the tendency in the United States that, you know, we now could expand democracy. Some people in the American establishment use the word of a new American imperium that was forbidden in the American democratic circles in the past. And what happened is that these 20 years that America became so much involved in this war on terror gave time to revisionist authoritarian powers such as Russia and China, gave them time to grow and actually project revisionist tendencies in the international system. What we see today is the result of those last 2 decades that I believe were lost, in the sense that we misprioritize our objectives in the West, especially the leading power of the West. And what you have now is 2 things. You have the liberal democracies and the authoritarian great powers such as Russia and China to project power, to project revisionist tendencies in a polycentric international system. And at the same time, you see democracy being tried in our Western political systems because of all these sweeping changes that I just described, that are happening in America, but also to a lesser extent, or in a different kind of way, are happening in the European Union itself. So it's not the West against the rest anymore, but the rest are within the West in the sense of problems against democracy. So we have a dual danger now. The external danger that comes from illiberal states. And, you know, in times of uncertainty and change, people are looking for quick fixes. And democracies are cumbersome systems that take some time to bring about changes and solutions to problems. And if people look for quick fixes, they are more vulnerable to strong men or populist leaders that claim to provide such quick fixes. That's another problem that we're facing today, that many people start imitating these strong men in Russia or in China or elsewhere because they can provide quick solutions. Look at Orban, for example. Orban is an example within the European Union of a political leader that in a populist and illiberal way is trying to provide leadership of a different kind, but a kind that erodes our democratic institutions. And it's not rhetoric anymore. It's his policies that are eroding the rule of law and democratic institutions. So to sum up, I would say that all this post-Cold War era was sort of mishandled. It gave time and geopolitical space to major powers such as Russia and China. to project power and project influence and revisionist tendencies against the international system. And if you combine that with the changes that are happening with our democracies, we have a dual challenge to face. Now, this is why I think the American administration under Biden came up with all this new policy about the Alliance of Democracies and the Summit of Democracies. But if you carefully read the subtext of these proclamations, you will understand that what we mean now is defending our democracies. So it's quite a different position than the post-Cold War kind of aggressive promotion of democracy. Now, democracy is in peril. We need to defend. Our stance, our position is a defensive one.
Actually, yeah, indeed. Thank you very much. That's a very interesting answer. And I'd like to pick your brain on the last point that you raised, and that's the extent to which and the ways in which we incorporate democracy defense and promotion abroad into our foreign policy objectives. You described the crusade, the global crusade for democracy America engaged on during the two Bush terms. So the Bush administration, and you perceived a change now in approach in the Biden administration, despite the fact that the democracy remains prominent in, for example, the Summit for Democracy. You are one of the most outspoken, I think, realists in the Greek academic and policy community. And so I wanted to ask you, how do you assess the prominence of domestic constitutional considerations such as, the democratization or the democratic nature of a country in our foreign policy rhetoric? I mean, realists have traditionally been dismissive, also during the Bush administration, about the excessive emphasis that was placed on internal constitutional arrangements in the definition of Western and particularly American foreign policy. So do you think that criticism is justified, or do you think there are serious grounds for the West and especially the European Union? The idea of promoting democracy abroad is also rather strongly ingrained in the self-understanding of the EU as a security actor. How do you assess all this sort of posture that there's also a moral dimension, right? A moralizing even dimension about democracy in our foreign policy? Is it constructive? Is it positive? Or you would criticize it?
Look, I think that if we look at US foreign policy, the ideological trends, but also policies, you will see that they are the result of a constant bifurcation between realism and idealism. And I would say that what America always stood for internally, but also internally in its formative years and its way to the superpower status as a beacon of democracy, as a model to be emulated, and then later on as a promoter of democracy. What always stood for was, the rule of law, democracy, human rights, freedom, liberty, and so on and so forth. I think that the whole Cold War was fought for these ideas, and also for geopolitical reasons. We should never underestimate the impact of ideas, ideology, and values in foreign policy formulation. So I think what happened was that after the war, the United States became actively engaged in the institutionalization, the construction of the so-called liberal order. The liberal order that during the Cold War had to do with the Western Hemisphere and Western Europe. America became an external federator, if I can use this phrase, when it came to European integration. And Europe became part of this liberal order. Europe became a normative power. Europe became an experiment of transferring national power to institutions with supranational tendencies. that had as an objective the establishment of peace, prosperity, and the eradication of war. That was our liberal order. And I think what happened after the Cold War was the policy of dual enlargement that actually reflected the expansion of this liberal order. Not as many revisionist historians are claiming now, even in the West, even in the United States, for reasons of expansion, for reasons of geopolitical aggrandizement. It was for reasons of responding to the demands of the people in Eastern Europe, in the Balkans, that wanted to become members, to become part of this liberal order. They wanted to become part of these Euro-Atlantic institutions. They saw the European Union as a guarantee for their democratic institutions and their economic development, and they saw NATO and membership in NATO as guarantee for their security. So I do think that in that sense, the liberal order represented a liberal idealist position that was lofty and worthy as a foreign policy objective. That does not mean that that this lofty idealist objective was not embedded in geopolitical factors. And so what I think went astray was in the post-Cold War era, this triumphalism that was the result of the end of history brought about hubris, in the sense that you cannot necessarily transmit and transplant democracy in every country, in every cultural setting, in every if you will, civilizational setting, as Montesquieu or Huntington has told us, and that I think backfired. So there has to be always a balance between the lofty and idealist objectives in the formulation of foreign policy, and the realism that goes with it, and I think highlights the limits of such policies. Now, that brings us to what is happening today. You know, the most important thing of what is happening in Ukraine, I think, is that Putin has constructed a narrative which is a false narrative, because Putin is trying to tell us, he's trying to demonize the West and victimize Russia. And what he's trying to tell us is that, you know, we have been aggressive after the Cold War, expanding our institutions at the expense of Russia's interest and Russia's geopolitical security, which is not the case. The fact of the matter is that we responded to the demands for membership on the part of the former Soviet satellites that saw their membership in our institutions as a guarantee for their safety and their democracy and their economic development. That's number one. Secondly, I think Putin is resorting to an outdated kind of realpolitik, in the sense that he brings back all these rationale of spheres of influence, buffer states, hegemony, dominance, the use of force. Look, international relations, and in that sense I'm a realist, remains to a large extent an anarchic nature, in the sense that there is no a centralized authority that will impose the rule of law. But at the same time, we have come a long way in institutionalizing practices and trying to bring about a more peaceful, a more cooperative kind of global design. Now, this is a resort to the tragedy of great power politics. This is a resort to what Putin is doing, is a resort to interwar kind of, or 19th century even kind of politics. And I think that it will backfire because I think that his escalation, his disproportionate escalation in Ukraine is bringing the opposite results in three fronts. Number one, I think that is recoupling the two sides of the Atlantic that had suffered sort of a crisis during the Trump administration and with America sort of retrenchment and pivot to Asia. I think that he's giving a new life to NATO because NATO is reinforcing its raison d'etre. And I think also that you'll see in the end of the day that he is bringing back a lot of unity in the West. And so I think that his intentions to upset or to overturn the post-Cold War settlement will backfire. I think his escalation and his fear of influence kind of politics and so on and so forth will backfire. I mean, he may win the crisis in Ukraine, but his victory will be Pyrrhic in the sense that his strategic objective to overturn the post-Cold War status quo, I think, will end in Ukraine one way or another.
Thanks, Constantine, and I can only wish you are correct. We will have to end. Thank you very much, Constantine, for being here. It was a pleasure, as always, to listen to you. I'm sure our listeners will agree. And yeah, let's end with the wish by the time we actually get to the 200th anniversary of Tocqueville's book in 2035, the state of our democracy will be better than what it is now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was today's episode of Europe Out Loud. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.